Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, January 4th. This is day 3 of the January CE. It's a two-part program today. First part will be the 2023 summary, just a review of some things, and then we'll get into the cardiac CE. So I took 2023 data. Some of this data, it was taken on the 30th of December, sometime in the mid to late morning. So it represents like 363.5 days or so. Some of them towards the end were taken in January, so that'll be the entire year. But it'll give you sort of a general feeling, a general sense of what the year looked like. Muting my phone here. Sorry about that. So overall, volumes increased year over year, almost 46,900. That's almost, it's a little over 300 more than the previous year. Transports per year are also up about 33,000. And I'll break down the dispositions here in a minute. This is dispositions of those patient contacts for the year. The light blue is ALS treat transport. The purple in the center, the two large chunks there are the treat transport sectors of this. And this zooms in on 2023. You see the big purple blob there is ALS treat transport at 42.8 and BLS treat transport at 28.6. Other numbers of note would be treat and release AMA 6%, a MPR 3%, and patient refused everything nearly 9%, 8.95%. This is ET insertion first pass success rate. So this is number of patients who had a first pass success. First pass is successful. The percentage is, the number of first pass successes is down. The percentage of first pass successes as far as patients is concerned is up, however. This is overall number of attempts. So total number of attempts divided by total number of successes. And you see that number, that light blue number for failures as a percentage is higher than we would like it. So iGels, 95.2 or 5%. So why not just use iGels all the time? Dr. Phillips' position remains. Endotracheal intubation is the gold standard for airway protection and ventilation. So iGel still is the backup. Now, you can put an iGel in cardiac arrest if endotracheal intubation is not feasible at the time, or obviously if it's unsuccessful. But endotracheal intubation remains the gold standard and the preferred method. IV success, 70% and a fraction in all patients and in cardiac arrest. I kind of expected to see cardiac arrest being a slightly lower number, and it is not. IO insertion, first pass success, 69%. So that's the dark blue bar, 69% of IO's first pass success. That number to me seems low. And if you look across the 5-year history, it's pretty consistent with previous years, but I'll also be looking at that to figure out, all right, so why are we missing 3 out of 10 IOs on the first attempt? Now let's look at ROSC. So this is any ROSC at all is anything other than the light blue bar at the top. So you can see that we're in the 22 to 30% range over the course of the years. And this is 100% of all cardiac arrests, and then the ROSC percentage is at the bottom. So, mid-20s to 30% is really consistent with national standards, actually slightly higher than some national numbers that I've seen. However, it's not where we want to be. Some of our regional partners are documenting higher numbers there, so we'll be looking at what some of those causes might be and moving in that direction this year. And then ROSC by airway. So if you'll notice, the 2 highest numbers here, the 3 highest actually, are all endotracheal intubation or orotracheal intubation. I'm not saying there's a cause and effect there, but if you are looking at the totality of the data for cardiac arrest and you're looking at all of the possible factors, IGEL, the first column there, any ROSC at all is at about 22%, and we're north of 30 with several of the orotracheals. So it may, I'm not implying a cause and effect, but there is a correlation here that has to be looked at and be determined, what is that effect, what possible effect could it be? So the second part of this update portion is a policy manual update. So we promised the chiefs and the coordinators that we would have the policy manual revised and posted. It is a big project with the policy manual because every policy either references an IDPH regulation that may have changed over the years since we wrote the original policy or last updated it, or in some cases, like with the system program plan update that we had to do this last summer and fall, IDPH just gives us a bullet list, a punch list of things that they want policies for, and there is no statutory or regulatory reference for that, which means we have to sort of make it up because IDPH tells us you have to have a policy on ethics, but doesn't say where that comes from, what's the benchmark that we are trying to comply with. So in some cases, we have to just make it up out of whole cloth. The policy manual is on Moodle. It's linked on Moodle. So if you ever need the policy manual, has been refreshed there. It's on the main page, the main menu after you log in. I am personally discouraging people from downloading the PDF and keeping it locally or printing it locally. Now, you can print it to do training on it, to pass it around, but when you print it, that's a static document now, and it may very well change. I can tell you for certain that the policy manual is going to change this month. When we moved over some policies from the old format to the new format, some of the dates didn't get transferred over. So that policy, those policies, and they tend to be in the middle of the book, I'll be honest, they will have to be revised in January. So if you print out a version of it right now, it is out of date in a couple of weeks. So what we're looking for is a permanent home for the policy manual where you wouldn't have to have a password login like on Moodle, where you could anyone could just click on it and get our policy manual. Advocate Health does not make that easy because they block all file sharing sites. So we're trying to figure out what a solution for that might look like. Other EMS systems and other EMS regions have regional websites that somebody pays for and somebody maintains. And that recently hasn't worked out. Having somebody else in the region maintain things for us hasn't worked out all that well, in my opinion. So we're looking for something that would be Good Sam specific. There can be many different ways of getting there, and I'll be talking about some of those later. So overall, policy manual, the 10,000-foot view of it, 14 policies had to be written to comply with the system program plan mandates. They were called 800-something before. You may see references to formerly 800-6 or whatever in the policy manual as it exists. Those things will go away, but we wanted to have a kind of a roadmap from things that IDPH saw to now where those things reside in the manual if IDPH should, want to look at our current policy manual at some point. So those 14 800 policies, 800 series policies are now part of the regular 7 sections of the SMO, or I'm sorry, of the policy manual. The first one I want to touch on is a brand new policy for patient care complaints. So we are required to comply with the statute that requires us to have a policy for patient care complaints that basically outlines what a complaint is and outlines what the process is. So the definitions are at the top, but basically it's an allegation of a patient care deficiency or some other thing that goes on. The complaint may be submitted by any means. I'm down into the policy now. 1. 2, it needs to be routed somewhere to us. And it, by the way, the patient complaint could go direct to IDPH. But typically they will go to the department or to an associate hospital coordinator or a hospital EMS coordinator who will route them to us. And then the procedure is we need to route that to IDPH. And it can be done intermittently or it can be done on a case-by-case basis. And then there's a whole, and this is basically just the statutory language from Section 515.450 and 530. So basically, it brings IDPH closer into the loop of patient complaints. Now, fortunately, these are very rare, so this process doesn't need to be triggered very often. And there is some flexibility in what defines an official complaint versus what defines a CQI matter. So we will navigate those waters carefully. We don't want to get IDPH involved unless it is necessary to per the statute and the law. But normal CQI things will still be ongoing. So this is the ethics and behavior. So they actually wanted an ethics and a behavioral expectations policy separate. We mashed them up into one. And I basically just adapted ACEP code for emergency physicians and pre-hospitalized it here. So embracing patient welfare, responding promptly and expertly without prejudice, discrimination, or partiality, respect the rights and strive to protect the best interests of patients, communicate truthfully with patients and medical control, respect patient privacy, deal fairly and honestly with colleagues, and take appropriate action to protect patients from healthcare providers who are impaired or incompetent or who engage in fraud or deception. It's a rare thing, but it has happened where someone comes to work less than ready to work, or someone comes to work and deals with things in an inappropriate manner because of personal stresses or personal issues they're having. So it is our job as a profession to protect our patients from harm, and that includes harm potentially even from people within our profession. Work cooperatively with others who care for and about emergency patients. Engage in ongoing study to maintain your skills and knowledge. Act as responsible stewards of healthcare resources entrusted to them. So wasting of medications, drawing up medications that aren't given means they go in the trash. That kind of thing is not being a responsible steward of the healthcare resources. Sometimes it's inevitable, but we have to guard against it, especially with the ongoing medication shortages that we have. And then the last one is all about culture of safety. So support and actively participate in a culture of safety that identifies opportunities for process and performance improvements, encourages reporting of errors and near misses, emphasizes process improvement without fear of punitive action, and operates with a primary focus of patient and provider safety at all times. In the hospital, we have a reporting system for that. It is a separate, a quality conduit, and it's meant to encourage, near misses, good catches, as well as, actual errors. We don't currently have that pre-hospital. Our larger Advocate Health EMS committee is looking at a standardized way that all of the resource hospitals could provide this benefit and to then utilize the data for reporting. But this is all about desensationalizing errors and near misses. Whenever possible, the culture of safety even removes punitive action. So it's not all about, I'm going to write you up because you screwed this up. It's about identifying what happened, identifying the factors that led into it, and figuring out how the process might be broken, the protocols might be broken, the system, larger small s system, the entire system of EMS and healthcare might be broken or might be improved. And then again, destigmatizing errors. Um, and one of the ways that we may push forward on this sort of parallel will be peer review of EMS reports. So not only from a documentation standpoint, but from a care standpoint. And it might, many of these things may just be that our process needs to be tuned up, that our priorities on first patient contact, our priorities on moving the patient from their environment to our environment, our process and the algorithm in our mind for when do we transport and when do we stay and treat the patient, and what things can be done en route versus are better done on the scene. All of those things need to be on the table for improvements. We want to take care of the patients in an appropriate manner, give them emergency and life-threatening care when it is needed, and then take the patient to the right destination in the right time. So anything that we can do to improve our processes, anything we can recognize in the way of opportunities for improvement of those processes needs to be engaged. This is about the airway competencies. It sort of fleshes out the airway competencies. But the right-hand side of the page here talks about logging of things, and even, what happens when you may be doing doing competencies elsewhere. The airway competencies are the airway competencies. Let's say you're working in York Center part-time and you are full-time up in Arlington Heights. Well, they have a airway competency program just like we do. So if you can prove your airway competency was met, if what they're doing meets our quarterly, like in the first quarter here, it'll be, oral and regular direct laryngoscopy. That's each quarter, actually, along with video laryngoscopy. So if you do those things in practice or in simulations, then that's good here. There is no downside to pulling out the mannequin and doing more work. And our first pass success rate and our overall endotracheal intubation success rate just bears that out. Now, the departments that I'm talking to today may have much higher numbers. That was the entire EMS system. That was the total numbers. So if you're better, and I'm going to be working with the coordinators on how to determine success rates at the individual agency level and look for opportunities for improvement there. But practice makes perfect, as the old saying goes. So there's no downside. Requirements for secondary status. So let's use the same scenario I just used. You're part-time in York Center, you're full-time in Arlington Heights, so your primary system is outside of Region 8. The Region 9 hospital, in this case, is going to be responsible for your relicensure. Bottom line is you need to declare your primary system status on system entry, and you need to declare whenever that changes, even to the point of I'm primary here, but now I'm off probation. I'm allowed to have my secondary hometown job back. And so I'm going to be secondary in McHenry's system because I live up there and I volunteer at that department. Okay, then you just need to let us know that we're your primary, you're secondary somewhere else. Do you need a letter of good standing? Do you need quarterly CE to prove to them that you're update? We will work all that out. You can get your own CE records from ImageTrend, which are slightly delayed in entry usually, but you have the ability to generate your own transcript. So your primary somewhere else, your secondary here. You have to do all of our CE, all of our competencies, all of our post quizzes. You have to maintain 100% of the CE in the region. So if you are primary in another region and secondary in Good Sam, you need to do all of our CE here. You need to know what our CE says. You need to know what our medical director is telling us to tell you. You need to know what the region and system information is. You need to do that stuff, and the post quizzes and the competencies here. If you do competency somewhere else and our competency here happens to be the identical thing, and you can prove that you've already done that, then you can provide proof of that to your coordinator, and that can be entered as a competency as if it was done here. If you are primary in Region 8, but not in Good Sam system, so you work full-time in the Central DuPage system or the Loyola system, but you are secondary, well, let me back up. You work primary in Loyola, but you are secondary here. Then you don't need to take the CE because our regional CE between Loyola and Good Sam is the same. You don't need to take the post quiz because the post quiz between Loyola and Good Sam is the same. The only thing that you would need to do is make sure that you are keeping up with our competencies here, because the competencies are not entirely synchronized across the region at this point. We're working in that direction, but we're, unfortunately, for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes, we're getting maybe further from that goal and not closer to it. So secondary here, but primary in the region. Just make sure that our competencies are completed, but proof of CE and proof of the post quizzes is good enough. What about if you're primary in CDH's system or an Edwards system? They are breaking away from our regional CE model. So we're going to have to work that out. If you are primary in CDH or in Edward, and you are secondary here, let's have a conversation about that, because we're using different post quizzes, we're doing different CE, and we're doing different. So those two things are 2/3 of what is, the standard of the region. So we're going to need to work on you if you are primary on the west end of the region and secondary in Good Sam system. I can't go through every possible iteration, so reach out to me and we will walk through what it is that we need to do. And also, if nobody calls, then we don't have a problem. But if lots of people call and say that they have that particular scenario, then we'll definitely have to work on it at the region level to come to an understanding. Patient care report completion. This is not a new policy, but it's been updated for the electronic world and also to embrace or to incorporate the new short form that IDPH requires. So bottom line is you have to leave something at the hospital with the patient. The exception to that is if you are required to immediately leave the hospital to go on another call. So you are immediately being summoned from the hospital to attend another patient event. So it's not, I need to leave because our station needs to be covered. That's not a reason per IDPH to leave the hospital. IDPH actually says there is no reason to leave the hospital without a report. We are giving these tiny little slice of the pie exception for you are out of ambulances and you are the closest ambulance to be able to respond to a new 911 patient request. Otherwise, you have to stay at the hospital and complete your report. So completing your report involves filling in all of the information necessary, posting the record, and then that is considered electronic delivery. Then it's either passed along via direct message into the chart, or it is sent over to No2 to be put into the fax queue. Hopefully it goes right through. Chances are it gets stuck in kind of bumper to bumper traffic for fax transmission. And again, if you're coming to Good Sam, it's going via secure direct message, hopefully right in the chart, although we'll be talking soon about destination barcode scanning, and that will enhance the first attempt matching of those records. So what if your computer is down? Your iPad croaks or breaks or whatever. Well, you can still do a patient care report. You need to find out a place in the hospital where you can get a computer that has internet access. You can go to the Image Trend website, log in as yourself and complete a patient care report there. So I'm not saying that somebody's standing at the door frisking you for a patient care report. I'm saying IDPH has requirements and we need to meet those requirements so that we stay out of their trouble. So another option, if you have total technological failure, is what they call this short form. And this was required. We had to create this in order to meet the statutory requirements. And this is essentially the bare minimum that can be left at the hospital in extremis. So I strongly discourage, and I will say this to every stakeholder group. I strongly encourage people to say, well, let's just do this, and then we'll go back to the station and we'll do our patient care report. When you do that, things get lost. If you don't plan on doing the patient care report at the time of patient contact, information always gets lost. So this is available in the case of technological failure. Our department should keep some of these printed and on the ambulance, but this should not become the standard for creation of patient care records. If for no other reason, then again, it's double entry because you'll fill stuff in here that you then have to fill in on another entry form. And secondarily, now there's two patient care records because when you create your record and you post it, it's going into the chart. So now there's two versions of this, which potentially may conflict, or certainly, well, yeah, they may conflict in total volume as well as in substance. So this is in case of emergency, break glass and take out this form and use it. And we expect the usage of this to be very, very low, but it is statutorily required and it is available. Sorry, I didn't have my chat window open. Okay, nobody's been sending me anything. No, it's just people coming and going. Okay. All right, medical device data importing. Going back to the beginning of paramedicine, we have always been required to paste up our strips and leave them with the patient chart. You say the patient had X rhythm, but having the actual picture there proves that you were competent in that regard. So for a while, we got away from making people print out and paste up strips. Now that we have all electronic transmission of this stuff, it's easy again. So this policy actually went into effect in July. That's when it finally was put into the policy manual. And as you can see somewhere down the line, it had a 6-month phase-in period. So we're really there. Now, I'm not at this point looking at 100% of the charts and requiring it. We do have I think, a NAG validation rule, which says, hey, you should be hitting the import your monitor button, or there should be at least, I think we had 2 validation rules, one of which was kind of broke, which I shut off the other day. The other one still works, which says, basically, there has to be something in the medical device section of the report, which means you imported medical data. It actually can be entered manually and satisfy that, but we'll be watching that. And if that happens to get around the validation rule, then we'll put something stronger back in. Bottom line is we need these strips. I had a call late in 2023 from one of our hospital EMS coordinators who wanted to know if we could get rhythm strips from a patient that had been brought to Good Sam in November, who was documented as being in a second-degree heart block, and they were cardiology was just sort of circling back to review the emergency care and the hospital care, and then the outpatient and follow-up care to make sure that they were doing the right thing, and they didn't have access to the original EMS strips. So all they had to go on was what EMS wrote down or chose from a list, and that's less granular than we need. So we need rhythm strips, we need capnography waveforms. And from your perspective, it's just easier to import the vitals from the monitor than it is to enter them, and it reduces the possibility of transcription error from one piece of paper or from a screen into another screen. So, oh, it's 2.2 where it was a 6-month of the effective or revised date of this policy. Bottom line is, if you're not doing it, and I think everybody that's on this call is doing it and doing it a very high percentage of the time, but one of our coordinators said, hey, there's no policy. I can't make people do it. So now there's a policy. So now apparently that coordinator can nudge people in the right direction. And then there's a whole background and history thing down there, which helps to justify why we should be importing these things. And also, the second paragraph of the background, why you should edit inaccurate data that gets imported. So we had a department who said, well, we were told to never edit anything once it's imported into the record, and that is not the gold standard. That is not the standard of care for, or the best practice for importing of electronic medical record data. If the data is in error, then you need to fix the data. The classic example of this is you're importing cardiac arrest data. Well, the monitor thinks that CPR is a heartbeat. So now it's useful to look at it and say, oh, look at all, it's all 130 right down the line. So the Lucas or the Auto Pulse or the Joe Pulse was doing the job and doing it well, and that's great. Except the document, your medical record now is going to say the pulse/heart rate was 130 when it in fact was 0. That was CPR being recorded, and it was essentially artifact in the pulse area. So you should be editing, if you import your cardiac arrest data, you should be editing those vitals to make those heart rates 0, because the heart rate refers to what the patient's actual heart rate is and not the artifact of CPR. So this helps justify the reason for you to edit those things if they are in fact not what that question is asking for. You know, it gets mapped that way, and if it was a patient without CPR, then that number would be relatively accurate for the heart rate. But in this case, that is artifact. That is not the heart rate. So a couple of policies at the end that we're going to zoom in on a little bit. And this is patient and patient contact. So there's definitions here, but those are kind of mirrored by the policy. So I'll skip the definitions and we'll go into, practically speaking, 1.1. A patient is a person encountered by EMS who meets one of the following criteria: a person with any sort of medical complaint, possible illness, or mechanism of trauma that could suggest injury to you, a trained healthcare worker, or has signs and symptoms of an illness or injury, or appears to be less than fully oriented or decisional, or has evidence of a behavioral emergency or suicide risk intent, or is deceased and requires you to confirm that. So there's like 5-6 different chunks of this. So if you, as a trained healthcare worker, do not find any sort of medical complaint, possible illness, or mechanism of trauma that could suggest injury, or sign and symptom of illness or injury. Let's isolate point 1 and point 2 to begin with here. So this to me is your, along with 3 actually, decisional capacity. These 3 to me are your usual invalid assist, your wheelchair assist, or in some cases, some of our agencies do simple things like they allow their residents to call the fire department, and the fire department sends people there to take them in their wheelchair down the steps from their bungalow down to their car and help them get into their car for a medical appointment in town. That's a total municipal thing. That's what that municipality expects. The residents expect of their emergency services. That's what the emergency services provide. That's their decision, not ours. So not injured, no medical complaint, no mechanism that says they could be injured, no signs and symptoms, and they are fully oriented, that technically is not a patient by the definition of this policy. So when we talked about the new run form and about the autofill button for either no patient contact, that one's easy, or the invalid assist, well, why is the only choice there non-patient incident? Why is that the only valid choice? Well, because of the matrix of choices, and any time you identify a patient contact, IDPH rules and regulations kick in that require a lot more than we need documentation-wise for an invalid assist or a wheelchair type assist. So we call it a non-patient incident. That's consistent with this policy. That's consistent with IDPH's definition of what a patient and patient contact are. So where you get into the difficulty here is these 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. So mental health, I'm sorry, 0.3 and 0.4. Any sort of behavioral issue or impairment or disorientation, that then means that you can't rule them out as a patient, so that means they are a patient. So the guy that only had 1 or 2 beers but says he's absolutely fine, doesn't want to have anything to do with you, you still treat that as a refusal. And the documentation standard then is higher. Behavioral, those are we've got a whole recent history of things like that where the patients are completely uncooperative, but that again is not a non-patient incident. It is a patient incident. It doesn't have patient contact specifically, but we still have a high documentation standard for that as well. And then the deceased, that is obviously a patient contact. That's the 000 or the DOA kind of thing. But this allows, if there is absolutely no mechanism, no medical complaint, no possible illness that was the cause of 911. I slipped off the edge of my bed, I lowered myself down to the floor, and I need to be lifted back into bed. That is a non-patient contact incident. And why am I making so much of a fuss about all this? Well, because 1.3 says, or 1.3.1 says, you have flexibility in how you can document that. You can still use image trend for all of your EMS sort of related sort of things. But the non-contact incidents who do not meet the criteria of patient and patient contact above in this policy can also be documented just as an NFIRS report. And I am as ignorant as anybody on the planet about how NFIRS works these days, but you're still doing NFIRS reports on your responses anyway. So do you have to do an EMS report just because the ambulance was involved? The answer is no. If there is a patient contact scenario, yes, you have to do an image trend report. But if it's an absolute no patient contact situation, the invalid assist kind of thing, then that could be an NFIRS report. If it's not an invalid assist type call, if you are sent and you can't find a patient, that's still considered an EMS response. So we would like those done on an EMS report. This just gives you a second pathway and maybe an easier pathway for potentially documenting the invalid assists, not as an EMS patient contact, but as a service call for the department. So I'm not telling you have to do it one way or the other. I'm telling you this is an option that your administration may choose to embrace, and so this is a departmental operational decision. If your department decides, okay, invalid assists now, the lift back into bed calls that we get are no longer going to be done on an EMS record, they're just going to be an NFIRS report, then that is up to your department to decide. We do not have a standard for documentation of non-patient contact incidents like this. Responses that don't end up in a patient contact, that's still an EMS response. We would like that. But you could send a rescue vehicle, a fire truck, a ladder company, two guys in a car to assist somebody back into bed, and that doesn't necessarily mean it was an EMS type response. So departments will decide how to use this, and if the number of invalid assist reports goes down, we're not sending those to IDPH anyway. So we're just giving you an opportunity, a place, a method of documenting, but not telling you necessarily how to do that. eBridge is another thing we want to burrow into here a little bit, because we've had a fall off in or an increase in the number of inappropriate eBridge uses lately. So eBridge is a very useful tool. To me, the most useful part of eBridge is, first of all, the behaviorals and the BLS streamlines, but also the early bedside notification of the time-sensitive patients, so stroke and STEMI patients. So what all this says is that there are certain times when eBridge is probably a better tool, but you don't ever have to use it. You can always pick up the phone. However, you should recognize that in some situations, it's probably a better choice. So behavioral alert patients, no chemical alteration. If they appear to be under the influence of anything, or if you have given them anything, then that cannot be an eBridge alert. You can't send an eBridge alert that says that you gave the patient Versed IM. If they're altered in any way, shape, manner, or form other than their behavioral pattern, then you can't use the behavioral alert. However, it is useful in those, sort of pure psychs. Not that there's that many pure psychs. Any metabolic, medical, traumatic etiologies have to have been considered and or treated. And if you have treated a metabolic problem, then that's a phone call. That's not a straight, pure behavioral alert. What happens is, if you just send an eBridge alert with a tiny little note, the tiny little note doesn't always get read. And then we figure out that, after the fact, or you get there and you say, oh yeah, by the way, his blood sugar was low and we treated him with DEEF-10. But he still got this behavioral issue. Well, no, that was not an appropriate use for eBridge. BLS alert is any patient who is pure BLS, so no medications. I would even probably not use it if I was even just giving oxygen, but oxygen's a BLS medication. So no ALS care or medication, and doesn't meet the criteria for initiation of ALS. So even if you decide not to implement ALS care because you want to minimize scene time and transport, and you are essentially giving BLS care during the transport, that is not a BLS eBridge. That's a deferred ALS care patient, and that requires a conversation. STEMI, so adult, not impaired, adequate blood pressure, does not require an advanced airway, and has only received medications that are in the protocol related to the STEMI alert. Again, to me, the best use of the cardiac alert eBridge is to send the alert the moment, the very millisecond after you decide this is a STEMI. So you get the patient, you run a 12 lead, you're gathering history, meds, allergies, and signs and symptoms. And from that sample history and from that 12 lead, you say ST segment elevation, myocardial infarction symptoms, let's call a cardiac alert. Somebody right there at the patient sitting on their sofa pulls out eBridge, sends the alert. Then you give an inbound phone call that says, hey, this is Lombard 44. We're inbound with the patient that we sent the STEMI eBridge alert about, and here's an update. Maybe it's just the ETA. Maybe it's, here's the medications that we gave since we gave that alert, etc. So as early as possible. When you send a STEMI alert eBridge, you also have to send a 12 lead. So this is new for Good Sam. It's a slide coming up, but I'll cover it now. Good Sam now requires a 12 lead like the rest of the hospitals always did. But this is something else you can do with eBridge. You have to send a picture. So print out the 12 lead, blast a picture of that. That's the attachment that you send. And make sure when you do your inbound phone call, then you tell medical control the 12 lead was transmitted with the eBridge. Now you can still send it the other way you do it, but that's more steps. You can print something and take a picture of it a lot faster than you can, send something up to the cloud and have that get transmitted to a destination. Cardiac arrest, adult, not in traumatic arrest, doesn't need decontamination. To me, we need some more things on the cardiac arrest form. We'll be talking about that at the region this month. Stroke alert, same thing really as the STEMI, except you're not going to be taking a picture of the 12 lead, although if you do a 12 lead, you can send that along as well. So adult, not impaired, blood pressure is adequate without support and does not have an advanced airway and has a positive stroke score. So let's review Cincinnati stroke scale. Let's say you can get only 2 of the 3 parameters. You can't get arm drift because the patient is completely flaccid. Well, that counts as an abnormal physical exam. But let's say you had one abnormal parameter and 1 normal parameter, and the 3rd parameter you're not able to obtain for whatever reason you want to document. 1 abnormal parameter means abnormal stroke scale. You don't have to have all 3 and then one of them is abnormal. If you can only get one of the parameters assessed and it's abnormal, it's an abnormal stroke scale. So please don't, there's a lot that are documented that are, unknown. And the reason they say they're unknown, from what I gather from the documentation, is, well, they can only fill out 2 of the 3 parameters. Oh, but that's abnormal if one of those is abnormal. So send that stroke alert. In this case, and in all the other cases, you have to send a picture of something. So particularly with the strokes, sending a picture of the patient's ID or something that gives their demographic information allows the hospital to do, to have that patient maybe pre-registered. And then we're off to the races when we get to the hospital. Otherwise, we have to do what's called a quick reg, which then needs to be reconciled, and it's just a lot more time consuming for the registrars. If we can get the patient registered ahead of time, that is ideal, because some of the barriers to getting the patient the care that they need are knocked down if the patient's registered already, because tests and things have to be ordered under a registration. So general guidelines: fill out the entire form, not just the parts that are required by the red highlighting, and sending that picture. The other possibility of sending pictures in some cases would be, physical pictures of injuries or pictures of crash scenes. In the case of crash scenes, this is in here because this is a sort of a blanket regional policy. Parts of the region use it for trauma alerts. We don't yet. We keep negotiating with trauma about that, but they seem to still want the phone call and the conversation. And then don't ever send a picture of the patient's face. The exception is if the patient's picture is on their driver's license and you send that, then that's okay. But no pictures of the patient without their permission. So just not at all. We're not sending pictures of the patient. All right, over the rest of the year, I'm going to cover the rest of the policy manual, but next month I need to cover, there's a lot of 600 and 700 policies that were these new 800 policies and need to be covered. So I'll be covering a lot more of these next month. So that's all for the first section. Let me switch PowerPoints here. Oops, switch to the same one. Okay, let's get going on cardiac. So STEMI versus OMI, obstructive myocardial infarction is the new nomenclature in medicine. I'll talk about a little bit of why that kind of applies to us, but kind of doesn't. Let's go through the normal updates here, region updates. So first region update, and I alluded to this before, is Edward Hospital, with very little notice, has dropped out of the region's CE process. So basically, we have half the region doing one thing. Good Sam and Loyola are still collaborating on CE. We're going to take turns writing sessions. And we're going to be doing 8 sessions a year. You have CDH, which initially deviated towards what I was led to believe was certifications-based CE. So they were going to do ACLS and PHTLS and GEMS and other things, and they were going to break those up by month, and they were going to do those over the calendar year. We found out last month that they actually have gone back to a model that is much closer to what we're already doing, which is PowerPoints and competencies and subject matter expert videos, which we moved away from at the region level because people weren't just stopped doing it. But I still like that. Get the medical directors on video. So they're actually doing CE that's much closer to us. They're just doing the things that they choose, not the things that the region is choosing. And then Edward just decided that they're not going to do what CDH is doing, but they're not also not going to do what the east side of the region is doing. So this makes it more complicated. It makes things like reciprocity a little harder because are we covering the same topics? Are we covering them the same way? Do we truly have the same standard of education and care across the region? So we have a meeting on the 17th with the medical directors to flesh or to hammer those things out. But bottom line is the workload will increase on us here, and we're looking at ways of figuring out how to do that. I'll give you one little tip is the live CE sessions may dwindle down as we go through this year, where I may just post up a narrated version, basically do a live session, but then post that up for everybody for the 3 days. And do it in a more modular fashion where, we break it up into segments, and then you can find things easier if you get called out in the middle of CE, which happens much of the time. You get called out and you left after 35 minutes, then you can skip the first 30 minutes of 15-minute modules, etc. So 22nd, sorry, I think I said 17th, but it's the 22nd. That's when the medical directors will put them in the square cage with the high sides, and we'll let them fight it out. Policy manual was updated and posted. I said that, but the dates will need to be updated. So anything you download or print is at risk of being outdated very quickly. That's why we're going for the online, real-time accessible version. And one way of accommodating that might be to either do our own SMO app, so go with the same company, but do our own book, which then would incorporate the policy manual and procedure manuals and other things, and you would always be carrying that with you, or go with a different app. There is a larger Advocate Health Initiative company that one of our Wisconsin hospitals physicians partners with and advises, and they have a really good app. You can download it and look at it if you want. It's available on the Google Play Store and the iOS App Store. It's called West Virginia EMS Protocols. That's an example of what our book could look like. So it would be protocols, it would be policies, it would be procedures, all interlinked. That's really difficult to do with a standard regional app because interlinking things, everybody would have to have their own SMO book anyway, because Edward's policies would link to their policy manual. So if you want to interconnect those things, it would be very complicated. And so we may go our own way on this, or we may figure out a way of doing it better. I've talked to you plenty of times about how we are very underwhelmed with how the SMO app is working now and how the update process is going. So we'll be talking about that on the 22nd as well. And then I'm going to be coming out and doing focus groups. So part of the go live with 3.5 and the new form has been allowing you to send me bug reports. I'm well into the mid 90s now in bug reports since we started this process back in, I think, November was when I first put that form, made it available online. Um, most of the problems are easily solvable. It's a validation rule that was written wrong or is applying itself, is being applied inappropriately to calls it wasn't, or patient records it wasn't meant to be applied to. In some cases, I'm starting to now get just ideas. Hey, this autofill button would be better if you added this to it. We found an autofill button the other day that was filling in exactly the wrong thing. And I don't know how I missed it and nobody reported it in 2 months. But finally, somebody said, hey, I can't satisfy this validation. And it was because it was a non-patient contact, canceled before seen. But the autofill button was, instead of filling in lights and sirens for the response, it was filling in lights and sirens for the transport. But there was no patient contact and no transport, therefore a validation error that couldn't be satisfied, and it was flagging the wrong thing. So 2 things got fixed with that rule. So I've had a great collaboration with many of you. Lombard, I'll put the spotlight on you. I've had great feedback from several people. You will be one of my first focus groups that I do, but I want to come out. I want to sit with you. I want to look at your workflow. One of the problems with Lombard is that several Lombard people are actually using Elite Field real time. They're charting patient bedside during transport, and that's something that I was led to believe nobody is doing. Everybody does it after the fact. So, shame on me for being ignorant of how you are working, but we're going to fix that. We're going to go out and we're going to look at the workflows, and then we're going to look at the form and figure out whether the workflow works for you or how it can be improved. And we tried that way back when with the short form and the long form. The other thing I came up with the conclusion is that from some of this feedback is that maybe our form is just over-engineered. I try to do too much with it, hiding things, disappearing things, making things appear, shortening lists. Some of that is really helpful, and maybe some of it is too much. So I'll have some examples of some other forms. We'll talk about it, what you like, what you don't like. So we're going to be doing some in January, some in February. Our account advisor from Image Trend is probably coming into town in March, and we'll be doing some larger sessions and some online sort of Q&A stuff there. So, this is not about me. I take my best swing and remember that I'm working for, in this regard, 6 different EMS systems, 7 actually now. So the one size fits all is very difficult, but y'all kind of do business the same way. I mean, if we eventually have to have a Good Sam specific form or Good Sam specific rules for visibility and things like that, that's absolutely doable. The purpose of this form is to allow you to collect accurate patient data with the minimum fuss as possible. All right, so on to the main meat and potatoes of the meal today, cardiac. So coronary artery anatomy and associated leads. I'm gonna talk a bit about the STEMI versus OMI thing, but it's really just to familiarize yourself with the concept of OMI and that it's roughly equivalent to STEMI. Classical and non-classical causes of chest pain, signs and symptoms of coronary artery occlusion, and then mimics of STEMIs. At the end, we'll do the usual sort of drug of the month, which will actually be 4, and capnography waveform. And I've got a little documentation tip on pain documentation also near the end. But let's start with a good story. So this story is now 3 days old. This is a story from the morning of New Year's Day, January the 1st. Patient, 46-year-old male, drove himself to our immediate care center, South Downers on Main Street in Downers Grove, and walked in there. He was seen by an emergency physician very quickly. Initially in registration, there was a little hang up with insurance, but they just pushed their way through that because he looked bad and his complaint was chest pain. So he was seen by a physician within 5 minutes of walking in the door for substernal chest pain or pain without or pressure, I should say. No radiation, no dyspnea, no diaphoresis, no nausea. So the pertinent negatives along with the actual patient complaint. History is recreational marijuana use and heavy drinking the night before, along with being a 1 pack a week smoker, but no particular history of cholesterol, and there wasn't a familial history documented that I could find. He was given aspirin. He had a 12 lead done. He had a saline lock plugged in, and he was given nitro. And that was within 10 minutes of him walking in the door. He had all that done. When the 12 lead was printed, 911 was called immediately because you see the V1, V2, and a little bit in AVR. So a septal sort of right-looking STEMI pattern here. So 2 contiguous leads with ST elevation, STEMI criteria, 911 was called. The emergency physician also called the hospital after the fire department got there and called in his own cardiac alert. So EMS contact, 911 was called. Station 5 is, or 105 is pretty close there. So they got there very quickly. A non-transport vehicle, ALS non-transport, and an ambulance. From first patient contact, so that was when actually the first clinician to see the patient was our very own Shelley Carbone from the Good Sam EMS office, who works in immediate care part-time. So she was the one that actually did the 12 lead and the other things. And from her first contact with the patient to when EMS made patient contact was about 10 minutes. EMS got the patient, repeated the 12 lead, 310 chest pain, gave the patient nitro, and began the transport. So the non-transport vehicle was released. The 2 medic transport began, and 3 minutes into that transport, the patient became unresponsive to a sternal rub, no longer talking to the medic, and was determined to be not breathing and have no pulse. So medic in the back starts CPR. They summon the ladder company back to meet them. The driver comes around, and somewhere during this CPR and initial phase of contact, they slap the pads on, and they find ventricular fibrillation, for which the patient receives a single shock. CPR is immediately resumed, and after about 15 seconds, the patient begins to start responding, begins to start moaning, moving. The patient has a pulse. Patient opened his eyes. He verbalized that he didn't feel good. A little too late for that, friend. And so this is the example of you shock the patient and you start CPR, and unless the patient pushes you away, you continue CPR until you have a chance to reaffirm the rhythm after a 2-minute cycle of CPR. In this case, it was the equivalent of the patient pushing them away. So top-notch thinking by downers. We administered 1 shock and the patient converted, therefore amiodarone drip was begun. 12 lead was repeated in the ambulance. You see a couple of different premature beats here, but you see that ST segment is still elevated in V1, V2. I'd argue it's also elevated a little bit in now V3. So the anterior septal pattern continues along with AVR, you can still see there. So you got premature, probably atrial or junctional beats. You got some PVCs in there. He's not great. He's just better. So they continue transport. They arrive at the ED. The cardiac alert had already been called. By the way, they gave an inbound phone call then about all of the shenanigans that had gone on. Let's talk about some time intervals. So 10 minutes from first clinician contact to when EMS made contact. From the time EMS made contact to when they arrived at the ED is 20 minutes. So that's that's getting the patient at the immediate care center, moving them to the ambulance, doing the things that I talked about, having the patient arrest en route, so stopping and dealing with that, and then continuing 20 minutes. So 30 minutes from first clinician contact to arrival at the ED, not necessarily patient handoff, but arrival at the ED. And then the patient went to the cath lab actually 31 minutes after the ambulance rolled onto the campus. So, it was New Year's morning, but cath lab was called early, and they met the time parameters that we have for their response. So all of that's looking good. I'm guessing, because I couldn't see the cath report, but typically it would be about 5 or 6 minutes before they get to the point where they can get a balloon going and get the artery opened up. But it was a 100% left anterior descending artery occlusion, and the patient got 2 drug-eluting stents placed for that. Resting comfortably now. It probably has transitioned out to intermediate care now from the CCU. But just an example of great integration of our services and great paramedic care. The first clinician to contact this patient was a paramedic, Shelley, at our immediate care center, not operating under the paramedic scope, but a paramedic nonetheless, who knew the right things to do in the right order and did them. And on through, so South Darwin's immediate care center staff, Company 105, the ED at Good Sam, and the cath lab, and we have a great outcome. So I want to do a great call every month that I'm doing CE. So if you have a great call, let me know. You can send me a note on Image Trend. You can send a note to your coordinator on Image Trend, who can then, loop me in on the conversation. And I find things, but I guarantee I miss things as well. So please report your great calls to me, and we can feature you with some good outcome data here as well. I know there's great stuff out there. And by the way, anything that gets submitted to me for consideration of inclusion into CE also then goes into the Hartman Award pile for consideration for the Hartman Award. So Downers, 9 hours into the year, has the first submission for the Hartman Award potential. That's this calendar year. We're already actually 6 months into the Hartman Award year, because it starts May 1st before EMS week, because that's when we give the awards. So we're 6 months plus behind already. All right, so the usual yada about cardiovascular disease. We always start with some statistics. These are the generic global statistics. It's obviously a huge frequent cause of death among patients on the whole planet. Risk factors here. I'm going to cover more about risk factors in EMS particularly, but a lot of these are all the same risk factors: high blood pressure, diet, cholesterol, the things that we'll talk about later. I wanted to focus in a little bit on Mission Lifeline. I think all of our departments partake in Mission Lifeline, but every year the criteria changes. So this is the 2024 criteria, and you can see there's actually 9 different criteria overall, but 2 of those require heavy hospital influence. But we're going to go in through the things that relate to STEMI here. I'm going to skip the first 4, which are stroke, and we're going to talk about the STEMI ones. So from first patient contact to the, from first patient contact and recognition of that this is probably an acute coronary syndrome patient, to 12 lead, a 10-minute window there. So from when you start to question the patient, and it's chest pain and it's radiating, and I got this family history and I got cholesterol, okay, we're going to get a 12 lead done here. That time interval should be very, very short. So if it's given to you as a chest pain call, the clock starts when you have first patient contact. Most everybody meets this without a problem. The one caveat here would be if you have a non-transport vehicle that gets there. Are all of the non-transport defibrillators capable of 12 lead? I think many of them, maybe most of them are. I probably, maybe not all of them though. I don't know. So 12 lead within 10 minutes of patient contact and recognition of the probability of a suspected heart attack. Aspirin administered, and this is aspirin at any time, so it's not related to the timing of the 12 lead or 10 minutes from this or 5 minutes from that. It's just they got aspirin. Now, your usual algorithm would be patient contact, 12 lead aspirin kind of at the same time, and then consideration for nitro after that. And then pre-arrival notification within 10 minutes of the 12 lead being done. So this absolutely screams for you pulling out the e-bridge and sending that cardiac alert for the STEMI and sending the 12 lead along with it. So if you want to make the phone call and just say, hey, it's Lombard 44, and we've got a ST segment elevation patient with chest pain, we're sending the 12 lead via the normal method. It's going to come in over fax, but this is your pre-arrival notification. So this is going to be the new one, I think. I don't think this was a 2023 criteria. So 10 minutes to get the 12 lead from in the suspected heart attack, and then 10 minutes from the 12 lead to notification of the hospital, the pre-arrival notification of a STEMI positive 12 lead. All right, this is the heart disease and EMS that we always like to cover here. Deaths from coronary heart disease among firefighters classified according to the duty going on. So you see most of it is response related, but some of it is physical and some of it is not. The very bottom one is unrelated to emergency duties. But it is the number one cause of duty-related death. 1 of every 17 is fatal, or 1 of every 18 is fatal. There are chronic and acute factors, and some of them are the same, like long sedentary, or I'm sorry, smoke exposure, noise exposure, sleep deprivation, but the acute ones tend to be more related to the fight and flight activation, the alarm response sort of thing, or other physical activity. Cardiac A&P. The man's heart hasn't changed. It's still a 4-chambered pump. It's meant to take in deoxygenated blood and send it to the lungs to be reoxygenated. So the blue dots go out and become red dots, and the red dots come back and get sent out to the big toe. There's valves involved that may be insufficient and may harm our mean arterial pressure and our cardiac output. Remember that the system is an electrical system and a chemical system and a mechanical system. So there are chemicals involved, electrolytes involved, movement in and out of cells involved in both the electrical and the mechanical portion of the cardiac cycle. So without chemicals moving, depolarizations don't occur and repolarization doesn't occur. And without chemicals moving across barriers and in and out of cells, the mechanical function doesn't happen. So let's not forget the electrolyte portion of the entire cardiac cycle, but it is an electrical and a mechanical function. And remember things like, where do the coronary arteries take root from? So they take root from the base of the aorta, just outside the left ventricle. So, and they fill during diastole. Remember, most of the blood gets squished past them. It's only when the aortic valve closes and that blood sort of pools outside the aortic valve that the coronary arteries do most of their filling. Also, the ratio of systole to diastole means diastole provides far more time for the coronary arteries to fill. So the range of coronary diseases, just regular coronary artery disease, plaque is building up. It's building up in all of us. The temptation is always there. There's always something going on. Angina occurs when there's lots of plaque. Some types of angina are related to vasospasm, but or a combination thereof. But so plaque builds up and it becomes harder for blood to get past that constriction, that narrowing. That is mostly a problem when exertion happens, when the myocardial oxygen demand increases because the heart is having to work harder, but the blood supply remains proportionally constricted. So no matter how much faster the heart beats, there still is a fraction of the amount of blood that the myocardium needs getting past this constriction. And then the infarction happens when that plaque narrows, and or it could be a thrombus floating down, or it could be the plaque. Most commonly, it is the plaque actually rupturing and then a clot forming there. If you have slow developing coronary artery disease, like the top one here, then hopefully it occurs slow enough that your heart develops collateral circulation, which allows you to withstand an insult like maybe a clot or a plaque breaking and a significant or total constriction. You won't compensate for a total constriction. You can compensate for a severe narrowing to some extent with collateral circulation. But patients, particularly in the non-angina world, patients can be asymptomatic until the lesion, exceeds 75 or 80%. Some people are still asymptomatic, and it's a plaque or a narrowing or a constriction is located or is identified on an angiogram, and it was a 90% occlusion, and it wasn't causing, heart attack kind of symptom. It was causing something else. So the new terminology in medicine is OMI, an occlusion myocardial infarction or a non-occlusion myocardial infarction. They are the functional equivalent of STEMI and NSTEMI. So you can continue to push the left button here. We're calling them STEMIs or non-STEMIs. You can have a heart attack without there being ST segment elevation or subtle things that don't jump out of you as an ST segment elevation. Maybe it presents in some other abnormal ECG pattern that is less obvious. So the OMI thing, one of the confirmations of the need for reclassification of some of these things came from this DIFO cult study. 3,000 STEMI, non-STEMI, and control group, so no myocardial infarction, 12 leads were re-examined, and they ignored the outcomes, but they did look at some lab values, and they figured out whether there was under triage of STEMI and NSTEMIs. And so what they figured out in these 3,000 patients, along with the troponin level, which we can't do, was that there was a under triage. So I can't remember the number, 28.2% of the patients were reclassified as having an acute coronary event related or that was identifiable by the parameters that the study looked at, which was troponin or an angiographic change, and then a 12 lead, or in some cases, not a 12 lead confirmation of that. The bottom line is that if you have to make the difference between an OMI and an NOMI by using troponin or an angiogram, then that's not something that's applicable to EMS. So our criteria is remaining the same. ST segment elevation in 2 or more contiguous leads. And then the patterns are obviously important as well. So typical and atypical signs and symptoms. Chest pressure, tightness, squeezing like an elephant sitting on the chest, typical sort of symptoms. All of these are non-typical, sharp or pleuritic or burning or aching or soreness or reproducible. Now, soreness or aching or burning in the epigastrum is probably it needs to be sort of in between these two columns, because it's not really a typical thing, but it's also not very unusual. It is a pretty common, but not a typical sort of classical thing. So radiation is a typical thing. Dyspnea, nausea, vomiting, that's why in the physician's charting from the Downers case that I cited before, the physician had the pertinent negatives in there. There was no nausea or lightheadedness or dyspnea. And then the feeling of impending doom, that is certainly a thing. In this case, the feeling of impending doom came after the doom. But if a patient looks at you and says, "I'm going to die," or this is it, then chances are pretty good that something really, really bad is going to happen. That's different from the asking the question, "Am I going to be okay?" That's a typical, sort of a normal response. Unusual fatigue, shortness of breath, also new onset shortness of breath that the patient does not typically have. Upper back pain, flu-like symptoms, dizziness, generalized anxiety, generalized weakness, indigestion, or palpitations. All of those things are associated with some past historical events. My STEMI sequence, it was, let's see, 15, I don't know how many years ago it was. It was nearly 20 years ago. It was actually PVCs. I feel PVCs, and I felt the palpitations. That was the first symptom. Then it was the tightness in the chest after that. So, palpitations cannot be ruled out. So if we take the men and women typical heart attack symptoms, you notice that the men tend to have the classical ones, and the ladies tend to have the non-classical ones, the weird discomfort in the back, or the stomach or pain, which is probably epigastric pain, or the unexplained anxiety, which is probably the equivalent of the male "I'm going to die," feeling of doom. Women have the unexplained anxiety, or can have. Uncomfortable pressure or squeezing, that's actually a common symptom between them. So your list of questions to ask and your list of rule outs, not really rule outs, but your list of potential symptoms is probably a lot longer in females as it is with males. And then on top of that, you have patients who are not responsive or who are impaired in some way, where your ability to get question and answer done is much harder. So you're stuck more with physical signs and symptoms and exam findings. So suspected ACS, let's run through the protocol. Adult initial medical care, inquire about patient's use of vasoactive drugs within the last 48 hours. Hyperoxia should be avoided. I'll be covering that in the medications section of the lecture today. And then aspirin, I'll also be covering that. If the patient has physician prescribed nitro, a BLS only unit can help them take it. And then the algorithm for ALS care. So 12 lead early, preferably with the vital signs, preferably before nitro. If it happens to be a vasospastic situation, then the 12 lead will be different before you give them the nitro, or can be different before and after you give them the nitro. So I know we've got like 3, 4, 5 paramedics on the call now. So let's get ready to give the nitro, and let's get ready to give the aspirin, but the priority really should be to get the baseline 12 lead. You can do the aspirin and the 12 lead at the same time, but even the artifact from giving the patient the aspirin and having them chewing it can impair the 12 lead. So do the right things in the right order, but let's make sure we prioritize the 12 lead, and then transmit it. Or if you see that it's a STEMI and you're going to send it with the eBridge alert, then get ready to do that. But this is a time-sensitive notification. When you see the ST segment elevation, you need to notify medical control for the specialty team activation as soon as possible. I mean, 10 minutes You should have it done long before or well inside that mission lifeline goal of 10 minutes. So continuing ECG monitoring, nitro if the blood pressure is 140, can repeat the nitro if the blood pressure remains 140 and you have the IV established. So what if the blood pressure remains 140 5 minutes after the first nitro, but you can't get an IV in? Well, then because the SMO says IV established, that's a medical control conversation. So, we have a blood pressure of 160 over 100 after the first nitro, but we were unable to get the IV started. So we need permission to give another nitro, or we would like to know if the physician would like to give another nitro. Let me take a moment to talk about medical control interactions in situations like this. We have identified, and you have helped us identify, that medical control at times can be more helpful. If you call medical control and they say, well, follow your SOPs, that's not helpful because you knew that. You didn't need medical control to tell you what you already knew and were already doing. If you're calling medical control and you're asking them a question, you need to have a physician give you guidance on what to do in this situation. So if you get that answer, if you are seeking an answer and you don't get it, you just take a big deep breath and then re-explain what your ask is. We were unable to repeat the nitro, but we want to know if the physician would like us to give nitro even though we haven't got the IV established. That will probably mean hold on and talk to the physician and maybe yes and maybe no. But if you are looking for an order, we're very distant from the years when we had to have orders for almost everything, and we're very out of practice in the art of communicating our ask and getting that need or that desire addressed. So just take a moment, re-explain what it is that you are asking for, and then hopefully you will achieve your solution. And then if the patient has pain and the blood pressure is adequate, you can go to the pain control SMO. So that would be the fentanyl page. Now, the question is, what happens if you get there, it's a STEMI, you give them the aspirin, but the blood pressure is 120 over 80, and so you can't give them the nitro? Well, first of all, that could be a medical control call. Like, all right, we popped an IV in him, but the blood pressure is 126 over 84. So should we give the nitro? It would help that they've already got the 12 lead in their hand and they can see that it's not a right-sided or inferior wall infarct. That would make them probably more comfortable with giving nitro to this patient with a blood pressure that's under our benchmark. Remember, the blood pressure benchmark used to be 100, and we bumped it up to 140 to cover the inferior wall patients who probably don't have a problem when they get the nitro, but they are the most likely to or sensitive to having a problem when they get nitro. So that's a medical control conversation. Again, I'm not trying to push us back to the days of hello Rampart, can I start the IV? But I'm trying to get us to be more interactive with medical control, getting the physician involved in the case earlier and getting better solutions earlier, other than just grabbing the patient and transporting to the hospital and having that solution occur 10 or 15 minutes later, because the SMO doesn't allow you to treat the patient. Medical control is still your partner from the moment you achieve patient contact all the way through handoff. We need to get better on both sides of the phone at this. We need our ECRNs to be better at not just saying follow your SMOs, and we need to have our medics better at communicating desires and asks. Unstable patients, you're not on there's very little you're going to be able to do. Altered mental status that's not otherwise fixable, or patient who's just outright hypotensive, there's very little. There's 12 lead, and there's aspirin that you can do, but this is take them to the hospital. And then the bradycardic and or hypotensive but not bradycardic patient who's maybe not terribly unstable, but is a little unstable. So this is where you have to take off your paramedic hat and put on your clinician hat. You know, the ones with the mirrors, you know, the old-time physician hats. And you need to determine what is the best thing to do in this for this patient at the time, at this moment. I like one of the things that are in that West Virginia SMO app that I told you about before. One of the things in the beginning of the book is these protocols are not a cookbook. They are a toolkit. So it doesn't mean you have to do everything on every page every time. It implies the correct order for things, but sometimes something that's on that page doesn't fit this patient. I'm talking about the patient with a heart rate of 56 or a heart rate of 64 who's got a blood pressure of 86/60 and who it has ST segment elevation and signs and symptoms of an MI. There is nothing about atropine or dopamine that is going to make this person's life any better. So the chances are real good you should be just transporting that patient. And the fact that the heart rate is less than 60 isn't going to be, if you raise the heart rate from 60 or 56 to 70, you haven't cleared out the blockage that's causing the MI. Same thing with the use of dopamine. If you take the patient's blood pressure at a heart rate of 90 or heart rate of 80, if you increase their heart rate to 100 and raise their blood pressure from 80 to 94, you have also increased their myocardial workload, and the chances are pretty good that his MI is going to get worse. So just because it's on the page doesn't mean you have to do it. You should do things when it's appropriate to do them, but in this case, it may be in the patient's best interest to leave those tools in the box. If it is an inferior wall MI, avoid lidocaine, but we're not giving lidocaine to these patients anyway. That's a throwback line in the SMOs. And then we're going to talk about this several times, but acute coronary syndrome in patients less than 30 is very uncommon. So unless the patient with chest pain also has 12 lead findings consistent with acute coronary syndrome, and another caveat, B, and they have not used cocaine, because that can cause 12 lead changes that are not an infarction but are cardiac related, then you probably shouldn't be doing aspirin and nitro with those patients. And then I already talked about this, transmitting a 12 lead is compulsory now. So good Sam, and I'm quoting something that I was told, so if that's not accurate, then I was given bad information. I am told that Good Sam, which for a long time would activate a cardiac alert without seeing a 12 lead, will no longer do that. So you need to make sure that you are transmitting a 12 lead. And again, it's real easy to do that time sensitive notification and the 12 lead transmission at the same time by using eBridge, particularly if you're coming to Good Sam. And eBridge may or may not be around forever. We may come up with a different thing, but the time sensitive notification aspect and the ability to transmit a 12 lead will remain. So let's talk about STEMI mimics. So some of these are like one-offs. Like there's a paper that identified a patient in 1987 had this situation. Some of them are much more frequently seen and more widely known. Acute pericarditis, inflammation of the pericardium, so you get that sort of pleuritic sort of chest pain. More tends to be sharper. Um, and then the 12 lead changes don't sort of stay the same. There's serial changes. the ST segment changes, there's T wave changes, elevations, depressions, and they don't all stay the same. So, a lot of this will come down to a full sample history of this event. Aortic stenosis or other aortic problems. The classic triad of aortic stenosis, so a narrowed aorta, is angina type symptoms, heart failure, including orthopnea or dyspnea on exertion, and then syncope on exertion. So all of this is related to the fact that there isn't enough blood getting out into the aorta and passed out into the body. So the functional reserve capacity is decreased, and the coronary artery blood flow is also harmed by this. Anxiety disorders, I skipped over that. A classical sort of, I'm rapidly breathing and then my chest starts to hurt from the rapid breathing. It is not probably a cardiac disorder. So again, we're doing differential diagnosis of chest complaints, not necessarily of ST segment change type complaints. Asthma, again, the breathing. Some asthmatic patients with the hyperventilation or breathing problems will get a chest pain, kind of a pleural rub sort of thing. And then chest tightness. It may not be a chest pain. It might be I'm having difficulty breathing and my chest feels very tight. That's a different kind of tightness to the squeezing of a STEMI sort of, or an OMI sort of thing. Dilated cardiomyopathy. So there isn't a direct cause of the chest pain, but it has to do with decreased coronary artery flow from decreased coronary, or I'm sorry, cardiac output. So the ventricle is enlarged, and that puts pressure on or other forces on the coronary arteries, which creates less blood flow. Just think of an elastic tube that is a given diameter, and if you stretch that tube, the diameter will decrease. So the amount of anything that could get through that tube would be decreased during that time. Gastroenteritis. So reflux, esophagitis, and gastritis presents with heartburn, epigastric pain, and sometimes even thoracic chest pain that is indistinguishable of that from coronary artery disease. What you're missing is any 12 lead conformation. So it could be kind of an NSTEMI presentation, but there would probably be a gastric history here or a dietary issue that you can identify with this. Myocarditis. Myocardial infarction, obviously, we know that one. So myocarditis. Patients with myocarditis may present with mild symptoms of chest pain, fever, sweat, chills, dyspnea, and if it's viral, like a 1 to 2 week history of flu-like symptoms and sort of general yuck. So the symptoms can be sort of mild, diffuse chest pain, not the more localized chest pain that we're used to in a STEMI. And then cocaine. Cocaine-related chest pain is the single most common complication cocaine users experience that requires emergency care. 60% of the patients who present with a cocaine type or a cocaine ingestion complaint end up presenting with cardiac type symptom complaints. Cocaine use is swinging to older people. It was formerly associated with much younger patient use, but now it's getting into the oldsters as well. And then some patients who have chest pain after cocaine use have a normal ECG, but some do not. In one study, 32% of cocaine using patients had a normal ECG, 42% had ST segment elevation, and then the remainder, which would be 74, so 26%, had other abnormalities like T-wave inversions or other non-specific, just general sorts of ECG changes. So this comes from the Discerning STEMI Mimics in the Field GEMS article if you want to get more research on this. So let's go through a few of the mimic type patients. I'll start out with saying that some of these descriptions are rather, well, they are much less brief than I would hope that you would get an assessment and be able to document a patient. But 31-year-old female, no past medical history, chest pain, fatigue, and chills for 1 day. Pressure is adequate. Heart rate is in the normal range. Patient is afebrile with a room air sat of 99. ST segment elevation in 2, 3, and AVF, the classical sort of inferior wall pattern, and an increased troponin in the ED. So there's the ECG. You see the lead 2, lead 3, and AVF, the classical inferior wall pattern, and an increased troponin. And that in the hospital tells us, it's more likely to be a cardiac complaint than not. However, the angiogram was grossly normal. So this is just two different views of it, but it's the same thing. And all the arteries are big and patent. You can't even see very much in the way of narrowing, much less occlusions in any of these. So full lab, full testing, and they came up with some lab markers that revealed Lyme disease, acute Lyme carditis. So Lyme carditis mimicking acute coronary syndrome. If you saw this patient, you would be presented with somebody who had a real meh sort of complaint, but it is a female, so the classical chest pain, STEMI, ACS complaint is less likely to be seen. But sort of chest pain, fatigue, chills, that's a real mixed bag of symptoms. And then you do a 12 lead and you got this inferior wall pattern. But remember, it's a 31-year-old female with no coronary history. So, rather than just blasting this off as a cardiac alert, we've got this sort of mixed bag picture here. We've got 2, 3, and AVF, but we don't have a classical chest pain. We have fatigue and chills. So what's the history of Lyme exposure here? Had this patient just been camping or hiking somewhere where, a tick bite might have occurred, etc. Just look deeper than the surface if the surface picture is not clear. This is a mixed bag picture. This is a patient who looks like, kind of a viral disease complaint, who then presents with this stunningly recognizable 12 lead. All right, second patient, 81-year-old male, chest pain, shortness of breath. Again, missing an OPQRST, missing history. Blood pressure is okay, heart rate's fast, but the patient's afebrile. Sinus tach with PACs, ST segment elevation in V1, V2, and AVR. So that's that septal sort of right side of the heart pattern. Large S wave in lead 1. There's the ECG. So into the hospital, lots of testing. Turns out, with the blood pressure and the heart rate there and the lack of sort of classical chest pain things, turns out to be a pulmonary embolus. That can cause chest pain. And in this case, it caused ST segment changes. So it was, obviously like a right side PE. So there is inflammation and pain caused by that. So findings of pulmonary embolus, T-wave inversion in right precordial leads. ST segment elevation and depression, typically in the right side, tachycardia, which this had, and then the rightward access 12 lead strain that you're seeing in this, along with the right-sided ST segment changes. So I'm just throwing the non-classical sorts of, or the mimics that may have some classical symptoms or certainly have 12 lead changes. So 47-year-old male, insulin-dependent diabetic, red flag, 12 hours of nausea, vomiting, burning, epigastric pain. Vitals are within normal limits, whatever that means. I didn't make these slides. These were holdovers from another slideshow. So sinus tach, ST elevation in V1, V2, and AVR. Again, the right-sided pattern. Large S wave in lead 1. There's your 12 lead. This has got the real ST segment elevation. I mean, it jumps out at you. You can't miss it in those. The AVR one is actually depressed with, so the description says ST elevation. I guess there's a little elevation, but then an inverted T wave, which drags it all down. But you can clearly see the ST segment elevation with the upright T waves in V1 and V2. So maybe another pulmonary embolus? Well, it's missing some things. Missing, is this a STEMI? Well, it's in the mimic slide, so it must not be. The other possibilities here are something to do with electrolytes. I've talked about electrolytes being part of the electrical and mechanical process before, and this is ST segment elevation due to hyperkalemia. This is a very rare finding, so this is one of the one-off sorts of things, and it's actually it has more to do with T wave elevation and peaking than it has to do with ST elevations. So most commonly seen in diabetic ketoacidosis, renal failure patients who have hyperkalemia. So this is when I said insulin-dependent diabetic, that was the clue in there. If you have ST segment elevation without the classical sorts of chest pain, now the epigastric pain is something, but it's not classical. It's in that middle range that I talked about. Then, and especially in somebody who's an insulin-dependent diabetic with a history of renal failure, we didn't talk about the renal failure history up there, then think about other things. Again, you got ST segment elevation, but a kind of a meh presentation. You know, this is a time-sensitive notification. It is not as much a time-sensitive transport, however. You can have the conversation on the scene before you transport. I know I'm really old, and I'm from the days when we made, UHF radio calls, but 95% of the time, our phone call was where we found the patient. We did not move the patient to the ambulance and make the call en route or while we were sitting out in the ambulance. We made the call from the point of patient contact. I just don't know why that isn't a thing anymore, because talking to medical control early in the call and helping to work through the mixed bag presentations that you get sometimes can be very helpful. All right, last patient of these scenarios, 24-year-old male. So is it a STEMI? Chances are almost infinitesimal that this is a STEMI. So, but it's a 24-year-old with shortness of breath and a cough and chest pain. Vitals are all looking hunky-dory. However, the SpO2 is 96% on high FiO2. So, what question is, what's the room air sat? Don't have that. The first time we see significant family history here, but no personal or family history, and a sinus rhythm with ST elevation in 2, 3, and AVF, so the inferior wall pattern. So that's really weird because this is, lead 2 and lead 3 and AVF, the classical inferior wall pattern. But a 24-year-old, so very unlikely to be an ST segment elevation myocardial infarction. ST segment elevation can come from other things as well. That's what we're talking about, all these mimics is, it's ST segment, but it's not an MI. So what describes that or what explains that? And what explains that is his dissecting aortic aneurysm. So a little more description of what that pain was like. Tearing, ripping, is it radiating to the shoulder or up or down? And then some history about his occupation, because The only risk factors here were gender. Men have more aneurysms than female, or males have more aneurysms than females. And he worked under harsh working conditions. So this guy was in a high stress, high physicality, long hour, highly stressful job. Said stress twice. Um, and that has a higher association with aneurysm. So, do you know anybody who lives, who is young and relatively healthy, but lives in a or works in a high stress, high physicality job? Okay, so just put that in the back of your mind. This ended up being a dissecting aortic aneurysm patient. So, a study about patients who STEMI mimics causing cath lab activation. It was a university medical center, not the one that we're most familiar with here. And there were 820 cath lab activations over 18 months and a 2.3% over triage. That actually, cardiac alerts, that was about the number that I was given, between 2 and 3% false activations, so false negatives. Um, so of the 2.3% over triage, these are the numbers of patients. So 5 of them were those myocarditis patients. 1 was, or 2 had an aortic problem. Weird one, subarachnoid hemorrhage, 2 of those. I'd love to burrow into those records and see what it was that caused the cath lab activation about that. But, 2% over triage, if you only had a 2% over triage or false activation of fire alarms, I hate to see what would happen to your budgets if only 2.3% of them were not false. That would be bad. As far as EMS responses are concerned, we have a well into the double digits, probably approaching 25% over triage, as in calls for EMS that don't end up being calls for EMS. And maybe even some of our transports fall into that as well. So, but the mimic tendencies in this studies, they tended to be male, 70% of them, more than 70% were. They tended to be slightly younger. So the younger they were, the less likely that a cath lab activation was valid or ended up being valid. They didn't end up or didn't tend to be hypertensive. Now, not every cath lab patient is going to be hypertensive, but the blood pressure of the average cath lab patient who did have a STEMI was higher than the ones that ended up being the mimics. Cardiac history is a big one. So no previous personal or family cardiac history. Obviously, everybody who has a heart attack has their first one. But if you had asked me, I would have said, oh, pretty good history of cardiovascular or vascular disease in my family. My father had 3-vessel disease. Several of my other blood relatives have had strokes. So we're bad on the vascular side. 50% less likely to be a smoker or have high cholesterol. So a contributory history, either be it a personal or familial cardiac history, or things that are associated with heart attacks like smoking and high cholesterol. And 66% less likely to have a family history. So bottom line is history is a big factor in reducing over triage and false cath lab activations, false cardiac alert transmissions. So think back over the mimic ones that we had. You had the female patient with Lyme disease who didn't have a personal or family history. Well, the personal history was undefined. So, but I think if there had been a family history, it would have been identified in the slide. So let's assume no history and a real sort of nondescript mixed bag presentation. And on the younger side, the guy at the end, in his 20s with no history, but with a high stress disease. or high stress occupation. So just factor history in. And again, maybe it makes the picture even more confused, in which case, call medical control and have the conversation. Mixed bag presentation, mixed bag history, pretty clear 12 lead. What's your pleasure? And if they ask, well, do you want to call a cardiac alert? Say, that's why I'm calling you. I'm calling you to give you the picture so that you can decide whether this is a cardiac alert. It meets some cardiac alert criteria, but some others are a mixed bag. And again, I promise you, we are aware of the issues that have been identified in communications and with medical control, and we are going to work on it from, as I said, both sides. All right, the medication portion of the presentation today is actually multiple medications. So this was originally MONA, morphine, oxygen, nitro, and aspirin. We put fentanyl in because we took morphine out, but really if you put them in the correct order, it would be consideration for oxygen, administering aspirin as appropriate, giving nitroglycerin when appropriate and unless contraindicated, and then consideration of pain relief with fentanyl. And remember, our goal here is to improve the myocardial oxygenation without increasing the myocardial oxygen demand and making the patient potentially worse. Overall, those are the goals of our STEMI care. And hand in hand with that are the time-sensitive notifications and transmission of 12 leads. So let's start with something that's not actually on the suspected ACS protocol. It's actually under the initial medical care portion of that, and that is whether we should give oxygen. Let's start with the understanding that hyperoxia is bad. So we should never be targeting an SpO2 of 100. If the patient is satting at 98% on room air and has crushing chest pain and ST segment elevation, I can't imagine not putting them on any oxygen, but it is correct and permissible to do that. And the study that this came from was an Australian study where half of the patients who had chest pain were not given any oxygen at all, assuming that they were saturating greater than 93% in this study. And the other half of them were given oxygen at 6 liters, regardless of where they were satting. It could have been 94, it could have been 100 on room air. They were given oxygen anyway. And the ones who were given oxygen did worse. They had worse outcomes, they had more complications. And why that is happening, you can speculate on. Does the body think that this extra oxygen is also another attacker in addition to what's going on in the chest, and therefore more complications occur? It would not be unreasonable to make that conclusion. Free radicals, all that stuff. So your chest pain patient, if they have minimal or no respiratory distress, the question is no oxygen or low oxygen. You don't reflexively go to high FiO2 oxygen on any of these patients unless they have severe respiratory symptoms along with it. So if they're setting at 97, 98 on room air, your question is no oxygen at all via cannula, or 1 or 2 liters by cannula. Again, if you bump them up to 100, you're putting them at the risk of more complications according to the studies that have been done. So while you think, well, if 98 is good, 100% is even better, that's not true in some of these diseases. But if they have respiratory distress, then you give them the appropriate SpO2 per initial medical care. Aspirin, 324 milligrams within the last 8 hours from the time you are making this decision. So if they take, like I do, 162 at 6 a.m. and we're having this conversation at 10 a.m., the question will be, will I accept the other 162 or not? If it's after 8 hours, so if it's after 2 p.m., the question will be, will I accept 324 or not? And again, back to the warning. Acute coronary syndrome in patients less than 30 is uncommon, and unless there is a 12-lead finding consistent with ACS and other symptoms, then you probably are not, should not be giving them aspirin. So this is all the patients who received aspirin last year, and actually this was done in November. So this was year to date. I'm sorry, this was the 12 previous months. So this is actually 12 months of data. So all the patients who received aspirin broken down into 10-year age increments. And the ones at the top, the dark maroon bar, and then there might be a little green bar, and there's a little dark blue bar on one of them. Those are all patients 29 years of age or younger, and none of them should have gotten aspirin because none of them that I could identify were actual MIs. So it was chest pain, but it wasn't, there either wasn't ST segment elevation or there were nondescript ECG findings. Now, you may have had one where you had a classical pattern like we saw in some of the mimics. And okay, if then, all right, I can understand why that one. But even that one is like patient's 24 years old and has some ST segment changes. I'm calling medical control. I'm not giving aspirin because it's just statistically almost zero that that patient is having an actual myocardial infarction. All right, so it's not zero. The incidence of AMI from a study in Norway in 2020, this is 33,439 patients. 2.1 per 100 were in the 20 to 29 year age range. There were none that were less than 20. So in that 20 to 29 age range, the dark maroon bar here, 2.1 per 100,000 ended up having an actual cardiac event despite their chest, or to go along with their chest pain. Whereas it went up eightfold when you went above age 30, and it went up eightfold again from the age 30 to 39 when you went up to age 40. So 2.1 is as close to zero as you can probably statistically get. So these bars should be down next to nothing. Now, if you call medical control and they said, follow your SOP, then okay, I get that. Then that should be well documented, by the way. We call medical control for guidance on whether to give aspirin to this 27-year-old with nondescript chest pain and no ST segment changes, and medical control said follow your protocol. So the question is, does the protocol say, with the nondescript chest pain and no ST segment elevation, should you be giving aspirin? Bottom line, probably most of these you should have stopped and called medical control. Of course, nobody on this call was part of this. Nitro, 140 is the minimum blood pressure, and you can repeat it ×1 if you have the IV established. And then fentanyl is 1 mic per kilo, repeat dose half. And if you're greater than 65, it's half a mic per kilo, and then a quarter mic per kilo as a repeat dose. And we're always rounding these fentanyls up or down. If the dose happens to be 64 mics, you round down to 60. If the dose calculated at 1 mic per kilo is 65, then you round up to 70. STEMI patterns, the classical ones we've already talked about. So this is easy to go through. Lead 2, lead 3, and lead AVF, the classical inferior wall pattern. In this case, we have a 100% occluded distal right coronary artery that feeds the inferior wall of the heart in most patients, or majority of feed in most patients. You got some reciprocal changes in the opposite side. Remember, your ECG leads that are seeing the elevation, think of that as a camera lens. Lead 2 and lead AVF are a camera at the left hip looking up at the heart from the bottom. Lead 3 is looking a slightly different way, sort of left bottom. So like 1, 2, 3 left side, but the lead is still the same one, positive lead down below. So if you think about what camera is on the other side of the heart looking at the back side of that same picture, it would be the leads where you have this depression. So lead 1 across the top, lead AVL, where the lead is at the top of the body, not the bottom or middle of the body. So we've ballooned and stented that, and it's nice and open. Here's anteroseptal with lateral wall. So this is really a lot of the anterior of the chest going all the way over to the mid-axillary line of the chest. So you've got the precordial leads, V1, V2, V3, V4, the stickies on the front of the chest. So we're looking straight back at the heart from the chest wall in effect. And you've got this 100% proximal LAD, ST segment elevation, and where all those green arrows are. The reciprocal view is the bottom of the heart, right? So 2, 3, and AVF. If we're looking at the sort of top front of the heart as seeing the elevation, then the leads that are looking at the bottom and sort of back of the heart are going to see the depression or the mirror image of that elevation. And we stent it and we open it up, and still, I mean, not got great flow, but it's better than 0. High lateral wall. So this is more the armpit leads, V5, V6 precordial leads. Got some elevation there. And then lead 1 and AVL, which is lateral. Now you've got this ostial branch of the left circumflex artery, which there's the ST segment elevation, the depression of the reciprocal leads, and we get across that lesion and get a stent or so on it, and we get this ginormous circumflex artery open up. And that was the one that got me. So, snapshot power tool. So I wanted to go through the PQRST for pain documentation. And if you don't use the snapshot power tool, this was a new 3.5 tool, and it combines a decent but not exhaustive set of vitals with the ability to do a decent but not exhaustive physical exam. So if you want to do a complete massive set of vitals, use the vitals power tool. If you want to do the kind of normal set of vitals, then the snapshot power tool is perfect for that. And at the bottom, you can click the add an exam, and then you can do like pupils and lung sounds and other things of limb pulses, etc. So we're at the very top of the power tool. Let's zoom on down to where the OPQRST part is. And notice there isn't any O. So the O for onset of pain will be the onset of symptoms field, one of the E situation fields. So that's not on this power tool. That's elsewhere in the run form. I could consider putting it on the power tool. I don't think I can do a times field, though. I think that was why I didn't do it before. But it would make sense if it's possible to either do it or display it here, that we could do that. But I don't think it's possible. But this is the PQRS and T part. So provoked, quality, region, radiation, score, and the time. Now, we don't have the time. Oh, the time is duration. Yeah, it is on there. I missed it on the slide cropping here. So here's the biggest problem I see with these. They are single selects, and we're going to talk about that with Image Trend this afternoon, because some of these, like the quality, it could be more than one thing. So what you're going to have to do is either choose the thing that the patient mentions first or primarily as the most outstanding quality of the pain or of the discomfort. And same thing with region. Well, region, it could be in multiple places. It could be in the chest and in the epigastrium. So where is the most pain? Go for the majority. And then you're going to have to document, in your narrative, more of the details of that. There is some text fields that are available, and we can look at maybe putting those on here where other OPQRST findings, and you could put, the other things that you couldn't choose because they weren't multi-select. So score and the pain scale type, typically it would be a numeric one, and then not going to be able to. Okay. So at the very bottom of the form then, and PQRST is near the bottom of the snapshot power tool, there is a button that says add exam. And if you click on that, then it opens up this stuff. So you see mental status, neuro, eye, skin, and then below that there is abdomen and extremities. So I took the top part here because it's the same physical exam that you're used to. Sometimes there's things within grids, like eye exam is a grid within a grid, so you'd have to click on add an eye exam, and then there is bilateral or left or right separate. The last thing I wanted to do on the exams is, so this is mental status, and you see there's a tag not present at the top. So in this patient, so this would be alert and oriented times 4, right? Person, place, event, and time. In this case, the patient was alert to the event and themselves and the place, but they were disoriented as to the time. So I did the regular tap on event, person, and time, and then I tapped tag not present, and I clicked on time. And on your run report, then it displays like this, and it doesn't display highlighted, but it displays oriented person, event, and place, and then exam finding not present oriented to time. I realize exam finding not present isn't exactly the language that we would like to use. Unfortunately, it's hard coded. So I would like to say, like, denied / not present, because not present doesn't imply that you ask the question as well as denied / not present. But if you have a set of symptoms that would include, oh, I would expect this other thing to be in there, and that thing is not in there, you can add that in there by using the tag not present feature of a power tool. All right, last thing of the month is waveform increasing suddenly due to ROSC. So on the left here, we've got, pretty good CPR going, and on the right, we have ROSC. So this isn't related to a change in CPR type, like went from manual to machine, or went from, Joe to Ted. We went from the same CPR and a sudden increase in the CO2. So our ROSC protocol calls for elevating the head of the bed slightly. This isn't even halfway. This is half of halfway. This is up like, 22 and a half degrees, up a quarter of the way. And what are we trying to do with that? We're just trying to increase venous drainage, get the stagnant blood out of the brain, out of the skull, and allow our newly found arterial blood flow to go in there and protect the brain. And then we're not supposed to hyperventilate or hyperoxygenate them. We ventilate them into the normal range of 35 to 45. And then if the patient presented in a shockable rhythm, like the Downers case I talked about before, and they hadn't already reached 450 milligrams of amiodarone, which they hadn't, then it's 150 over 10 minutes. So first shock in your resuscitation converts the patient. Then they get the amiodarone drip. They get 300 of amiodarone and you shock them, they can get the amiodarone drip. They get the 300 and then the 150 and then they get converted, then that is no amiodarone drip. But this is again another conversation to have with medical control. All right, we shocked the patient a total of 7 times. So long after we finished the antiarrhythmic portion of the protocol, we were past the bicarb when we achieved ROSC. So it's been 12 clock minutes since the patient had their last amiodarone. Should we consider, would you like us to do the amiodarone infusion while we transport, even though the patient has already received their 450 milligrams? It's not a question that, should be just ruled out from being asked. Again, if it's your usual code and you've gotten conversion early, then the question answers itself. But by the way, we have a 20-minute transport time because it's January the 20th, and we had a foot of snow over the last 12 hours. So it's going to take us a long time. Does that change medical control's view of using more amiodarone? I don't know. It's a conversation to have. Check and recorded blood glucose. A note about blood glucose. I see a lot of repeats of the same blood glucose number. I'm certain that it comes from using the repeat last vitals button. But when you do that, like I saw a chart the other day, and 3 sets of vitals in a row, 10 minutes apiece, all had a blood sugar reading of 166 on them. The last 2 cannot be verified to be accurate. The blood glucose may have changed. You don't know that. So unless you took 3 blood glucose readings, your chart should only include the number of blood glucose readings that you took. Make sure you empty out the extra ones or the ones that copy from a previous set of vitals. And, maybe, as it is in some places, blood glucose should be just a separate vital tool by itself without all of the other things. So it would be a separate entry on the timeline. Maybe that's a good idea. I don't know. I guess we can talk about it. And then we get to the pressor portion. So we have ROSC, but we have inadequate blood pressure. So CDH, and when this was written, it was going to be what they thought was going to be Good Sam was going to be the only one using number 8. As it turns out, at least half the region, and I think maybe 3/4 of the region, is not using the push dose epi as the pressor. So we're using dopamine. We do not use number 7. It should say system specific on there, but again, it was written at a time that it was assumed by the people that were doing the SMOs that everybody was going to follow them down that path, and that didn't happen. And then a 12 lead post ROSC, always a good idea. And then if the patient changes their rhythm, then change the page that you are on. Okay, that's it for today. The post quiz is still not up. I will work on that this afternoon. It will certainly be up by your next shift. I got to get it by tomorrow because I promised Tuesday that they would have it by their next shift. So, and then the competency for the month will also be posted. Again, this CE happening this early in the month, I just didn't get things done. So I apologize for that, but we'll get it done. Happy New Year to you, and I will see you next month with another live CE. Bye-bye.